The air in Mississippi during the spring of 1845 didn't just hang, it felt like a physical weight, thick with the scent of pine resin and the iron-rich tang of river mud. At the Hollow Creek plantation, the grandeur of the white-pillared manor stood in stark, cruel contrast to the jagged reality of the quarters, where the earth was packed hard by the feet of the weary. On this particular night, the sky had turned a bruised, sickly violet, and the wind carried a low, mournful whistle through the cypress trees. It was a night meant for endings, yet something entirely unprecedented was beginning. In a small, drafty cabin at the edge of the property, a woman whose name has been scrubbed from every official ledger lay on a bed of corn husks. Her sweat was cold, her breathing shallow, and as the first crack of thunder split the sky, she felt a tectonic shift within her body. She was a woman who had already given everything to the soil of a land that did not love her, yet she was about to bring forth a mystery that the masters of Hollow Creek would spend the next century trying to bury under ash and silence. Laboring in the dark was a lonely ritual for the enslaved, but tonight, the isolation felt amplified by the violence of the storm. There was no midwife to offer a damp cloth or a soothing word. There was only the rhythmic drumming of rain against the cedar shingles and the flickering orange light of a dying hearth. The woman clutched the rough-hewn floorboards, her knuckles white, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew, with the instinct of someone whose very survival depended on reading the hidden signs of the world, that this birth was different. The weight within her was not singular, it was a heavy, shifting tide. Each contraction felt like a wave pulling her deeper into an ocean of shadows. When the first cry finally broke through the roar of the thunder, it was followed almost instantly by a second, and then a third. In the dim, flickering light, three tiny, identical faces emerged into the world, their skin glistening with the dew of a hard-won arrival. They were triplets, a biological rarity that should have been viewed as a miracle, but in the brutal economy of the 1840s South, they were immediately seen as something far more complicated. The news of the birth traveled with the speed of a lightning strike. By the time the storm began to recede into a low, grumbling growl over the horizon, the heavy boots of the overseers were already thundering toward the cabin. They didn't come with blankets or medicine. They came with lanterns and ledgers, their shadows stretching long and distorted against the cabin walls. When they pushed open the door, they found the mother huddled in a corner, her arms wrapped around three small bundles of rags. The overseers paused, their breath visible in the damp air as the light of their lanterns fell upon the infants. To these men, who viewed human life through the cold lens of ledger columns and harvest yields, the triplets were not children. They were anomalies. They were a curiosity that defied the predictable rhythms of the plantation. There was an unsettling symmetry to the girls, the way their features mirrored one another perfectly, the way their small hands seemed to reach for each other even in sleep. It was a sight that stirred a primal, unnameable fear in the hearts of men who believed they had mastered every element of the natural world. Master Silas Thorne, the proprietor of Hollow Creek, was a man who prided himself on his scientific approach to the management of his estate. While the overseers spoke of omens and ill-omened harvests, Thorne saw a different kind of potential. He was a man obsessed with order, categorization, and the acquisition of the rare. When he was summoned to the cabin to witness the miracle, he did not look at the exhausted mother with even a shred of empathy. Instead, he leaned over the infants with the clinical detachment of a man examining a new breed of livestock. Identical triplets among the enslaved were virtually unheard of in the medical journals he frequented, and he immediately recognized them as a trophy that could elevate his status among the elite circles of the South. He imagined the papers he could write, the physicians he could invite from the city, and the profit that could be squeezed from their unique existence. But even Thorne felt a shiver of unease when he noticed that the infants did not cry like other children. They were silent, their dark eyes wide and fixed on the ceiling as if they were listening to a frequency that he could not perceive. The cruelty of the plantation was often swifter than the stroke of a lash. Before the mother could even memorize the specific curve of each daughter's brow or the unique warmth of their skin, Thorne gave the order. The triplets were to be removed from the quarters immediately. His reasoning was framed in the language of preservation and study, claiming that such rare specimens could not be left to the superstitions of the slave cabins. In reality, it was an act of total domestic colonization. The mother's screams were swallowed by the vast, indifferent Mississippi night as the children were pried from her arms. She was left with nothing but the lingering scent of wood smoke and the crushing weight of an empty cabin. The girls were carried across the manicured lawn of the big house, but they were not taken to the nursery or the guest rooms. They were headed for a space that Thorne had designated as their laboratory, the deep, damp cellar beneath the foundations of the manor, a place where the sun never reached and the stone walls were thick enough to muffle any sound of descent. The cellar of Hollow Creek was a subterranean world of weeping stone and perpetual twilight. It smelled of wet earth and the slow, steady rot of old grain. As the heavy, iron-bolted door was swung open, the damp air rushed out like a cold breath. Thorne had directed the construction of a partitioned space within the darkness, furnished with nothing but straw and coarse blankets. As the triplets were laid down on the rough floor, the silence of the room was absolute, save for the scratching of rats in the corners. They were barely a day old, yet they were already prisoners of a man's intellectual vanity. Thorne stood at the threshold, his lantern casting a halo of sickly yellow light, and watched as the three infants instinctively huddled together, forming a tight circle of warmth against the encroaching cold. He believed that by isolating them from the world, he could unlock the secrets of their shared biology. He did not realize that by locking them in the darkness, he was creating a sanctuary for a power that would eventually ripple outward and shake the very foundations of his house. Though Silas Thorne refused to grant them names, recording them only as Specimen A, B, and C in his private journals, the names their mother had whispered in the cabin survived the transition into the dark: Sarah, Scylla, and Serenity. These names were not just identifiers, they were the first acts of resistance. Even as the girls were sequestered away from the light of day, the whispers of their names began to circulate through the plantation like a secret currency. In the fields, men and women would murmur the names under their breath as they worked the rows of cotton, turning the triplets into a symbol of a mystery that the master could not truly own. In the kitchen, the house servants would pause as they prepared the elaborate meals for the Thorne family, their eyes casting toward the floorboards, imagining the three small souls breathing in the dark beneath their feet. The names became a prayer, a way of anchoring the girls to their humanity in a place designed to reduce them to objects of study. The sisters were lost to the cellar, but they were found in the hearts of those who shared their chains. The years beneath the foundations of the Hollow Creek Manor did not pass in the way they did for the children of the sun. For Sarah, Scylla, and Serenity, time was not measured by the shifting of shadows or the ripening of the cotton, but by the slow, rhythmic dripping of condensation down the lime-streaked walls. In that subterranean world, the girls grew into a singular entity, their lives woven together by the shared experience of the damp and the dark. They learned to navigate their stone prison by touch and intuition, their hands rarely losing contact with one another. To any observer, they would have appeared less like three distinct children and more like a single organism with three bodies and one mind. They did not play with toys or dolls. They played with the echoes of their own breathing and the vibrations of the house above. Their language was not one of words, for they had no one to speak to but themselves, and they found that speech was unnecessary when every thought was mirrored in the eyes of their sisters. They grew in height and strength, yet they remained as silent as the stone that encased them, a quietness that was far more unsettling than any scream could have been. As the sisters reached their 6th year, Silas Thorne's ambition to turn them into a scientific spectacle finally bore fruit. He invited a delegation of the South's most prominent physicians and naturalists to Hollow Creek, transforming the damp cellar into a macabre theater of inquiry. These men arrived in black coats with leather bags filled with gleaming steel instruments, calipers, speculums, and heavy ink-stained ledgers meant to capture every minutiae of the Hollow Creek triads. To these men of reason, the girls were a puzzle to be solved, a biological glitch that required categorization. They spent weeks in the dim lantern light, measuring the circumference of the girls' skulls, the length of their fingers, and the synchronization of their heartbeats. They were looking for a flaw, a sign of the unnatural that would justify their own prejudices, yet they found only a terrifying perfection. The girls would sit for hours, motionless and unblinking, as cold metal was pressed against their skin. They offered no resistance, yet their very compliance felt like a form of defiance, a refusal to acknowledge the humanity of the men who poked and prodded them like specimens in a jar. The physicians' journals from this period reflect a creeping sense of unease that began to erode their professional detachment. Dr. Alastair Sterling, a man who had seen the most gruesome injuries of the era, wrote in a hurried, trembling hand about the unison of the subjects. He noted that when one sister was pricked with a needle for a blood sample, all three would flinch at the exact same millisecond, though only one felt the steel. When one was fed a morsel of food, the others would swallow in perfect rhythm. It was as if their nervous systems were tethered by invisible threads, a shared consciousness that defied every known law of medicine. The physicians began to realize that they were not observing three separate lives, but a single, distributed soul. This realization did not bring them closer to the truth. It only filled the cellar with a thicker sense of dread. The men began to drink more heavily in the evenings, trying to wash away the memory of the 6 dark eyes that watched them from the straw, eyes that seemed to be peering into the very depths of their own compromised spirits, judging the cruelty they called science. It was during one of these cold, clinical nights that the humming first emerged. It did not begin as a song or a melody, but as a low-frequency vibration that seemed to originate from the very floorboards of the cellar. At first, the physicians thought it was the wind moving through the manor's chimneys or the distant rumble of a passing storm. But as they leaned in closer, they realized the sound was coming from the girls. Their lips were barely parted, their chests barely moving, yet a deep, resonant tone was filling the room. It was a sound that didn't just hit the ears, it vibrated in the marrow of the bone. It was perfectly harmonic. 3 voices layered so precisely that they created a 4th, ghost-like frequency that seemed to make the lantern flames flicker in sympathy. The sound was ancient and wordless, carrying a weight of sorrow and power that silenced the scratching of the doctor's pens. For the first time, Silas Thorne felt a flicker of genuine fear. He had wanted to own their bodies and their history, but he realized in that moment that the girls had found a way to communicate that he could never hope to regulate or understand. The humming quickly became the defining characteristic of the Hollow Creek Manor, a constant, low-level drone that seeped through the heavy oak floorboards and into the refined living spaces above. During the day, it was a subtle background noise, easily dismissed by the clatter of the kitchen or the shouting of orders in the yard. But at night, when the house fell into its uneasy rest, the sound would swell. It would drift up into the master's bedroom, a persistent, unyielding vibration that made sleep a jagged, difficult thing. Thorne's wife began to complain of headaches and strange visions, claiming she could see the shape of the music moving in the shadows of her room. The house servants, who had always been more attuned to the rhythms of the plantation, recognized the sound for what it truly was, a lament and a gathering. They began to notice that the local wildlife was reacting to the cellar's chorus as well. The hounds would refuse to bark near the cellar doors, instead tucking their tails and whining, while the horses in the nearby stables became skittish and prone to kicking their stalls whenever the humming reached a certain pitch. In the quarters, the news of the singing sisters was met with a mixture of reverence and terror. The mother of the triplets, though forbidden from ever approaching the big house, would stand at the edge of the fields every evening, her head tilted toward the manor. She could feel the vibration through the soles of her bare feet, a secret message from the daughters she had been told were dead or departed. For her, the humming was a lifeline, a sign that her children had not been broken by the darkness. She began to lead the other enslaved workers in their own quiet songs, weaving the girls' subterranean tones into the spirituals they sang as they picked the cotton. It created a strange, invisible bridge between the world of the light and the world of the stone. The humming was becoming a map of resistance, a way for those in chains to realize that there was a part of themselves, their voices, their spirits, that no iron could ever truly hold. The cellar was no longer a prison. It was becoming the heart of a slow-burning rebellion that Silas Thorne could feel but could not see. As the girls entered their teenage years, the nature of the humming shifted once more, growing in complexity and volume. It was no longer just a low drone. It began to take on the qualities of a complex, polyphonic weave. Visitors to the plantation would often stop mid-sentence, their faces pale, asking about the strange music they thought they heard coming from the gardens. Thorne, desperate to maintain his image of control, began to invent increasingly elaborate lies, claiming it was a new type of wind chime or a peculiar geological phenomenon unique to the Hollow Creek soil. But the physicians who had stayed behind to continue their studies knew the truth, and they were beginning to break. One by one, they packed their bags and left, citing nervous exhaustion or unforeseen family matters. They left behind journals that were increasingly incoherent, filled with sketches of the triplets and descriptions of the sound as something that was eating the silence of the world. The vault of the cellar had become a vessel for something too large to be contained, and the pressure was starting to crack the very walls of the manor. By the sweltering summer of 1847, the atmosphere at Hollow Creek had curdled into something unrecognizable. Silas Thorne, once a man of cold logic, was now a portrait of frayed nerves and quiet desperation. The humming from the cellar had become an inescapable tenant of the manor, a vibration that seemed to have settled into the very grain of the mahogany furniture and the marrow of Thorne's bones. Desperate to reclaim his authority and silence the subterranean chorus, Thorne turned to the only language he truly trusted, the language of force. He summoned Harlan Price, a man whose name was spoken in terrified breaths across the county. Price was a specialist in correction, a man whose hands were calloused by the handle of a lash, and whose heart was a barren waste of empathy. He arrived at the plantation with a coil of black leather at his hip and a cold, predatory gleam in his eyes. To Price, the triplets were not a mystery to be studied or a miracle to be feared. They were simply a spirit that had not yet been sufficiently crushed. He viewed the cellar not as a laboratory, but as a forge where he would bend the three sisters until they finally broke into the silence he demanded. The first time Harlan Price descended into the cellar, the air itself seemed to recoil from his presence. He carried a heavy iron lantern that cast long, jagged shadows against the weeping stones, its yellow light illuminating the three sisters as they sat in their accustomed circle. They were no longer the small children the physicians had measured. They were young women now, their presence filling the cramped space with a heavy, pressurized energy. As Price stepped onto the damp straw, the humming did not falter. Instead, it shifted, deepening into a resonant, rhythmic drone that seemed to pulse in time with the flickering flame. Price sneered, his hand tightening around the grip of his whip. He began with threats, his voice a gravelly bark that had made grown men weep. Yet the sisters did not even look at him. Their eyes remained fixed on one another, their faces serene and impenetrable. The overseer, accustomed to the immediate submission of his subjects, felt a surge of hot, indignant fury. He believed that pain was the ultimate truth of the world, and he was determined to introduce the triplets to its most agonizing vocabulary. The War of the Lash began in earnest that night, but it did not go according to the brutal script Harlan Price had written for himself. He struck the first blow with a crack that echoed like a pistol shot in the confined space. Yet what followed was not a scream. Instead, the triplets' humming surged in volume, weaving into a complex soaring harmony that seemed to absorb the sound of the whip. With every subsequent strike, the sisters did not flinch or recoil. They leaned toward one another, their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles turned white, their voices rising in a choral defiance that made the very stones of the cellar quiver. Price, sweating and cursing, redoubled his efforts, but the more violence he exerted, the more the air in the room seemed to thicken. The lantern light began to dim and pulse, as if the oxygen was being consumed by the sound itself. He felt a strange, cold vibration traveling up the handle of his whip, a resonant frequency that made his own arm go numb and his heart stumble in its rhythm. He was witnessing a form of resistance that bypassed the physical entirely, a shared endurance that turned agony into a symphony. When Harlan Price finally emerged from the cellar hours later, he was no longer the man who had entered. He was pale, his clothes damp with a cold sweat, and his hands were shaking so violently he could not coil his lash. He did not report his success to Thorne. Instead, he walked past the master without a word and sat on the edge of the porch, staring into the dark of the woods with vacant, wide eyes. The other overseers, men hardened by years of cruelty, watched him with a growing sense of dread. Price began to mutter to himself about the eyes in the dark and the song that eats the soul. Within 3 days, the man who had prided himself on breaking the unbreakable had vanished. He left his whip and his belongings behind, fleeing into the Mississippi night like a man pursued by ghosts. He was seen weeks later in a neighboring town, a hollowed-out wreck of a human being who would burst into tears at the sound of a distant bee's hum. The correction had failed, and in its wake, a new and terrifying realization settled over Hollow Creek. The triplets could not be silenced by the world of men. The disappearance of Price sent a shockwave through the plantation's hierarchy. The other overseers, once eager to prove their toughness, now refused to go near the cellar even during the brightest hours of the day. They made excuses, claiming the air below was foul or that the stairs were unsafe, but the truth was written in the way they avoided the big house altogether. the power dynamic of Hollow Creek had shifted on its axis. The master's house, once the seat of absolute control, was now a place of contagion, haunted by a sound that the lash could not reach. Among the enslaved, this failure was a spark of hope that threatened to become a wildfire. If the triplets could resist the most feared man in the territory through nothing but the power of their voices, then the chains that bound the rest of them began to feel less like a permanent fate and more like a temporary condition. Silas Thorne found himself a king in a crumbling castle, surrounded by men who were afraid of 3 teenage girls and a song that wouldn't die. The war of the lash was over, but the fire was just beginning to stir in the shadows. In the weeks following the fire, a different kind of destruction took place at Hollow Creek, a cold, calculated burning of the truth. Silas Thorne, now a man possessed by a frantic need to salvage his reputation, turned his attention to the paper trail of his failed experiment. Every ledger that mentioned the specimens, every drawing made by the city physicians, and every ration record that accounted for 3 extra mouths in the cellar was gathered and fed into a small, private bonfire behind the ruins. Thorne realized that if he could not control the sisters in the flesh, he would control them in history by ensuring they never existed at all. He rewrote the plantation's birth records, backdating entries to claim that the mother had delivered only a single stillborn child in the spring of 1845. It was a bureaucratic execution, an attempt to suffocate a miracle with ink and lies. To the outside world, Hollow Creek became just another tragedy of the Old South, a house lost to a summer storm, its deeper mysteries buried under layers of revisionist ash and the silence of a man who feared his own legacy. Despite Thorne's efforts to rewrite reality, he could not touch the archives of the heart. The mother of the triplets, though sold off to a distant estate in the frantic liquidation of Thorne's remaining assets, carried the truth in her very marrow. She became a silent witness to a history that had no paper. In the new fields she worked, she never spoke their names aloud, for she knew that names were things that masters could steal and twist. Instead, she carried the frequency of their humming in her throat. She would sit by the fires of her new quarters and breathe the 3-part harmony into the air, a secret transmission to the daughters she believed were now part of the wind and the water. This oral record proved far more durable than Thorne's scorched ledgers. The story of the singing sisters of Hollow Creek began to drift along the riverways and through the slave markets, a ghost story that functioned as a manual for spiritual survival. It was a tale that whispered of a cage that couldn't hold, a lash that couldn't break, and a fire that served as a carriage rather than a coffin. Decades after the war had ended and the last of the Thornes had faded into obscurity, a single terrifying fragment of the truth surfaced in a forgotten trunk in New Orleans. It was a singed, water-damaged page from a private diary belonging to one of the physicians who had fled Hollow Creek in the middle of the night. The handwriting was jagged, the ink nearly translucent with age, yet the words were a chilling rebuke to Thorne's erasure. The entry, dated July 1847, spoke of a unified pulse and a sound that reordered the air of the room. Most haunting was the final line, scratched so deeply into the paper it had nearly torn through. "We have sought to measure the soul with calipers, but these girls are not made of the same clay as we. They do not die, they merely change their state of being." This scrap of paper, now held in a private archive, remains the only physical evidence of the sisters' existence. It serves as a stark reminder that science, when faced with the inexplicable, often retreats into the same shadows it claims to illuminate. The note suggests that the physicians didn't leave because of nervous exhaustion, but because they realized they were the ones being studied by a power they could not name. As the generations turned, the specific details of the Hollow Creek fire faded into the realm of local folklore, but the humming survived as a cultural artifact. In the rural communities surrounding the old plantation, folk singers and bluesmen began to incorporate a peculiar, low-frequency drone into their music, a third note that seemed to vibrate even when only 2 strings were plucked. They called it the Hollow Creek chord, and they claimed it was a sound that could only be learned by sitting in the silence of the woods at midnight. To those who knew the old stories, it was the acoustic ghost of Sarah, Scylla, and Serenity. The sisters had become part of the American songbook, their resistance encoded in the rhythms and harmonies of a people who understood that the truest history is the one that is sung. The music became a vessel for their spirit, ensuring that every time a lullaby was hummed in the dark, the triplets were being remembered. They were no longer captives of a cellar, They were the architects of a sound that defined the soul of the South, a melody that reached back through time to touch the very chains that once tried to bind it. Today, the site of the Hollow Creek Plantation is a tangle of kudzu and reclaiming forest, a place where nature is slowly digesting the hubris of the past. The grand pillars of the manor have long since collapsed, and the red soil has swallowed the footprints of the overseers. Only the cellar remains, a blackened, stone-lined crater in the earth that stays strangely cool even in the height of the Mississippi summer. Local residents and urban explorers who visit the site often report a sensation that defies rational explanation. They speak of a subtle, subterranean vibration that can be felt through the soles of their shoes, a rhythmic pulsing that seems to synchronize with the listener's own heartbeat. Some claim that if you stand in the center of the ruins and hold your breath, you can hear a faint, harmonic resonance rising from the soil, a sound that isn't quite wind and isn't quite silence. It is as if the land itself has a memory, a recording of the sisters' final defiance that refuses to be erased. The humming is a permanent scar on the atmosphere, a reminder that some truths are too heavy for the earth to ever fully bury. The case of the Hollow Creek Triplets remains a haunting enigma because it forces us to confront the limits of our own understanding. We want a neat ending, a record of their flight to the north, a grave to lay flowers on, or a scientific explanation for their shared consciousness. But the Triplets offer none of these comforts. They remain a story made of shadows and sound, a narrative that exists in the in-between spaces of history. They represent the ultimate failure of ownership. Silas Thorne could own their labor, their time, and their bodies, but he could never own the frequency of their souls. Their disappearance was not an escape from reality, but an entry into a higher form of truth. The realization that the human spirit, when joined in absolute unity, becomes a force as unstoppable as a storm and as eternal as an echo. The sisters did not leave Hollow Creek to be found. They left to become the song that haunts the house of the oppressor. As long as the ground vibrates and the air hums in the quiet corners of Mississippi, the Triplets are still there, hand in hand, walking through the fire of history and into the light of an unbreakable forever.